welcome again to my show, Searching for Integrity. My name really is John Smith, and I'm searching for people with integrity. Why? Because our country suffers from IDD, Integrity Deficit Disorder. We have as our guest today, Mehta Webster. Is that right, Michael?
Mm-hmm.
Great. And his book is The Rescue Effects. It also has a minor source, if you'd like to tell us what that is.
Are you talking about the secondary title?
Yes.
So the secondary title is The Key to Saving Life on Earth.
There you go. That's important, you know. Concentrate on that. You know, your book, I've stole information from a lot of these reviews that you're getting, and they are plentiful. I would say that, which means you're doing well, and if nothing else, you're getting their attention. I think that the book dives deeply into stories of species and ecosystems that are adjusting to our changing world. That was one of the comments. And I have a question for you. Is mass extinction inevitable?
I have to think of how exactly to answer that question. I think what you're getting at is it necessary that humans are going to cause a large fraction of the different kinds of life on Earth to go extinct? And the answer to that's no. If you look at what's happened already, there have certainly been extinctions, and we've lost some amazing species, on our planet. But at this point in time, it's a very, very small fraction of the different species that are out there. You know, a tiny fraction of 1% that we've lost to date. And so I think one of the things that was one of the more optimistic conclusions that I reached in doing the research for this book is that if we're thinking about sort of this extinction crisis that we are creating as a species, we're really looking at it from the very beginning right now. And that means that there's a ton we can do if we want to really avoid going further down that road. We have a lot of options. We have a lot of agency.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I bet. What do you, I'll throw a wild one out there. Are we going to get very far past Russia and Ukraine before the world ends? How's that?
I certainly believe so. I don't think that the world is coming to an end anytime soon. And certainly nature is not coming to an end anytime soon. The title of the book is The Rescue Effect. And the reason I gave it that title is what I'm talking about there is the ability of nature to recover after disturbances, to adjust to new conditions. And it's actually a really powerful part of nature. Nature is really good at dealing with change. And there are all these mechanisms that are built in, sort of automatically turn on when the environment begins to change. And so, humans certainly are incredible at changing the planet. And we've done it in so many different ways on a geological scale, a very short period of time. So far, most forms of life are in the process of adjusting to those changes rather than succumbing to them.
Right. Well, it's there's a lot of definitions and information here. You've got at least six, I should say, different processes contribute to the rescue effect. I'd rather you pick one or two, or you can do all six. It's up to you.
Sure. And the idea there is that, my background is I'm an ecologist. I'm a biologist. And so I study organisms and ecosystems. It's been my work historically. And so when I started thinking about what's going to happen in the future with the diversity of life on Earth, part of me went back to sort of, okay, what are the options that species have to be able to adjust what they're doing to be able to live under different conditions? And so what you're getting at are sort of that list of different things that go on in biology that help organisms adjust. One of them is a really sort of straightforward process that anyone can sort of relate to. All organisms have the ability to live in different kinds of conditions. You look at, even people, for example, most of us don't live at particularly high elevation. Most people live, at sea level or within a few thousand feet above sea level. But if we go up into the high mountains, our bodies automatically recognize that we are in a different kind of environment, and our physiology begins to adjust. Things like our breathing and our behavior in terms of where we stop running, we walk more slowly, we take our time, and our blood begins to change to produce more hemoglobin, to draw more oxygen out of the thin air at high elevation. That isn't something you have to ask your body to do. It isn't something you have to think about. It's one of those things that is turned on automatically just because the environment has changed around you. And what's going on there in scientific terms, that's a change in your phenotype, is the word that a scientist would use to describe that. And a phenotype is just sort of your physiology, your appearance, the genes that are on versus off in your body at any given time. And we have all these different genes in our body, and we don't use all of them at all times. Our body selects, oh, it looks like I need that one now. I'm going to turn that on for this new set of conditions. So all organisms can do this. They can move from one habitat to another, or they can live in slightly different temperatures or different conditions. And they've got tools built in for being able to deal with some of those changes. As our world is changing so quickly, and as we think of things like climate change, this ends up being one of the first lines of defense for organisms. They begin to change their phenotype in response to the environment that is changing around them. Some organisms can change their phenotype a lot. Some of them can only change it a little bit, but all can do it somewhat. And it's one of those things that kicks in to help deal with a changing world.
I can attest in an experience I had once upon a time, about 30 years ago or so. We moved from Texas to the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, and we lived in Breckenridge, ran a ski school and ski lodge. What I noticed right away is that all that training I had done over time, it was gone. There was nothing there. I was trying to do triathlons up there. I just couldn't do it. It was
easier to go the other way from
yeah, that's right.
But my guess is that it didn't take that long. I think it's about 3 weeks to completely adjust. But after about a week or two, you probably were feeling a lot better. You're probably starting to get your legs back, and because your physiology was shifting in response. And then after that, you should have been just fine.
Well, it took me a little longer, but yeah, because again, I was trying to train as much as I could, but to have to smack my cheek in the mirror, slow down, and,
yeah,
and that was true. The sixth rescue effects. What do I want to say? Effort. It's an effort. It's an effect. Is one or two of these one of your champions? Are they remarkable more over the other?
It's really not. And here's the interesting thing. So in the book, I talk about different stories about different organisms and different places, and really look at what's happening to them in their environment. There's a chapter about corals in the Caribbean. There's a chapter about a little marsupial that lives in the mountains of Australia. There's a chapter about tigers in India. And if you start looking at, for any one of these organisms or places, there's a whole bunch of different things that are changing in their environment at the same time. And in response, what's going on for every one of these organisms is that sort of a cocktail of different processes are turning on simultaneously. It's not just one, it's this, 1 + 2 + 3 + 4. And collectively, all of those different things that are turning on are helping the organism to adjust. So one is the changes in the phenotype or the physiology that we were just talking about. In some cases, organisms are actually moving from one location to another. This is especially an issue with climate change, as average temperatures change or precipitation changes in one place. An organism might find that it actually doesn't do as well where it has lived, its ancestors have lived for hundreds of years. But you might find, for like a tree species in North America, that it might be doing really well at the northern edge of its range and maybe not as well at the southern end of its range. Well, as more seeds are produced, those seeds might fall further and further north, and you might see that tree species moving up further northward in latitude. And what's happening there is that the range is shifting for that organism as the climate around it is shifting. Now, we know that organisms have done this in the past. For example, during the last ice age, a lot of North America was covered under, miles thick glaciers that scraped the ground all the way down to bedrock. When the glaciers retreated, things like lakes were formed, which captured sediments. And you can look at the sediments in the bottom of the lake and see, well, what was living there at different times in the past, if you drill it down like a tree core. And what you can see is that different species sort of moved through a region as the ice was retreating and, progressively moved further and further north. And so we know that species do this sort of movement as their environment changes. In that case, it was changing because of the end of the last ice age. Now it's changing because our climate's getting warmer and warmer, and those same kinds of mechanisms are getting triggered. But for an organism that's going to progressively move to a new place, having other tools like being able to adjust its physiology along the way to deal with smaller changes in the environment, that's really, really helpful. And so in that case, those two different processes, moving to a new location and adjusting your physiology, are going to work hand in hand to make it successful as it's dealing with sort of these broader environmental changes.
Well, that's the amazing part of this, as I view it, in my simpleton view. It's one which sometimes and I see something that you were an academic and probably still are a scientist at Cornell.
Yeah, I visited at Cornell last year, so I was there for 1 year. And my current position, I'm a professor in the environmental studies department at New York University.
And you've got Oregon State here as well?
I did my PhD at Oregon State and stayed to do some research after that. Yeah, my expertise is in coral reefs. So I wrote my PhD thesis on coral reefs and how coral reefs work. And, coral reefs are probably one of the most threatened ecosystems on the planet. And in some ways, they were the inspiration for this book because I don't know if you've heard anything about coral reefs, but if you see stories in the newspaper, usually they'll talk about things like coral bleaching or declines in coral reefs. The news is largely bad news. And the reason that this is happening is that, one of the main reasons is that the world is getting warmer on land. The water is also getting warmer. And corals, they're these funny animals that grow rocky skeletons and build reefs. They're very sensitive about temperature. And as the world is getting warmer, it's causing them a lot of stress. And in some cases, they're dying. And so we've had this question working on coral reefs of, are corals going to actually be able to survive climate change, or are we destined to lose coral reefs on the planet? So some of the research that I've done recently has really looked at whether or not corals may be able to adjust to changing temperatures. And part of that would be changing their physiology. But one of the really big questions on corals is, can they actually evolve new capabilities? And can they do that quickly enough to keep pace with how fast the environment is changing? And so I've worked with other scientists to sort of use scientific tools and models to try and figure this out. And the answer we've largely come up with is we think they can, so long as we begin to slow down climate change over time. We think corals may actually be able to evolve their way out of the problem that we've created for them. And that's a really big deal because it means that, maybe 100 years from now or 200 years from now, we'll have corals that can survive in reasonably different conditions than they can today because of evolution happening on a short time frame.
Well, you lead an interesting life, I can say that. And my wife's going to smack me if I don't tell everybody in the world that she's a Cornell engineer.
So, oh, really? Fantastic. Well, I genuinely enjoyed my year at Cornell. It was a wonderful place to be.
Yeah. Let's see. There are some things in here that I believe struck my interest. And I think it was a matter of the books themselves about how they are stories of species and ecosystems that are adjusting to our changing world. And a lot of times when I'm talking to people, I just don't get it. but a lot of times I do. It's amazing depending upon what you hang your hat on and what you don't.
Yeah, I think that's right. And part of my goal in writing this book, the way that I approach writing this book is, I've written plenty of scientific papers and talked with plenty of scientists before, but I was interested in trying to get to a different audience and talk with people who maybe are interested in nature and maybe concerned about nature, but aren't necessarily going to read, the scientific journals. And one of the ways to sort of understand what's going on in these systems that's, I think, more approachable for a lot of people is to actually couch it within stories. So like one of the chapters in the book, I mentioned it earlier, is about this funny little marsupial that lives in mountains in Australia. And these little guys hibernate in the wintertime. And it's an unusual place in Australia because there's lots of snow in the wintertime. And so these guys burrow under the snow and they wait it out until spring comes. And
Right.
they presumably been doing this for thousands and thousands of years in this kind of environment. And it turns out that the snow paradoxically keeps them warm because it creates an insulating layer on top of their little burrow. And so they can, eat over the summer, get fat, they can store some food, and they can make it through the winter and get to the spring. But with climate change, there's less and less snow in these mountaintops. And what that means is the insulation layer is disappearing for these little guys. And because it's getting warmer, they're more likely to freeze to death. And it's this weird paradox because it's really the loss of insulation because of the loss of snow. And so this species actually is at very high risk of going extinct. And it raises this sort of social question of, well, what should we do about that? There's obviously reasons for us to want to slow down and stop climate change, but that's not going to happen fast enough to save this species. What do we choose to do in the meantime? Do we just let it go extinct? Or do we try and intervene in other ways? There's a group in Australia that is contemplating taking some of these little organisms and moving them to another place where they think they might be able to survive, so that if they go extinct on the mountaintops, they still live somewhere on the planet. But doing so means taking a new species and introducing it to a different ecosystem. And we can never know all the consequences of that. Is it going to cause something bad to happen? And so it creates this interesting public conversation about, well, what should we be doing here? Should we be moving things around? Should we be trying to keep them the same? Should we let them go extinct? And there's no right answer to any of these questions. But I think it's really important for people to be sort of asking those questions, and using a story about a particular species helps make it much more real.
I agree with that. And that's what kind of gives me an idea about what I'm doing and what I'm learning and how it's going to come about. Actually, when I do an interview like I do now, I go through, I'm a table of contents guy. And and that basically says, why did you say this chapter with this particular phrase?
Well, you want to ask me table of contents questions from my book? Anything catch your eye in there?
Yeah, let's start at the beginning. So, what is son of Panna?
Son of Panna. So that chapter is about a tiger. The son of Panna was an individual tiger, and he was a really interesting tiger because I actually encountered this tiger on a trip to India. I got to see it in the wild, an amazing, majestic, extraordinary creature. And I just learned a little bit about it while I was there. And when I came back and was working on writing the book, I started doing research into the backstory of this one particular tiger. And it was really kind of a fascinating backstory. It turns out that this tiger came from a park in India called Panna. And he was the grand cub of a group of tigers that had been captured elsewhere and introduced to that park. The problem was that poachers had removed every last tiger from that park. They'd hunted them out to sell illegal wildlife products. And the managers in India were like, wow, we need to fix this. So they went to the nearby parks. They tranquilized some tigers. They moved them to the new park. They let them go and hoped that they would survive. And they actually did survive quite well. And they had lots of offspring. They had so many offspring so quickly that within those sort of 3 generations, the park was already starting to get crowded. And so this son of Panna, in Hindi, he's Panalal, he grew up in this park. And when he was, the tiger equivalent of a teenager, he started to look for his own territory. and he decided to leave the park. And he ended up walking across about 100 miles of like ag lands, highly densely populated with people. I mean, imagine this, like, working in your field and seeing a tiger ambling across through your crops. I mean, this would be an absolutely terrifying experience for people. And the tiger managed to walk this 100 miles or so and find an entirely new, different park. And he's like, oh, this is great. I'm going to set up shop here. And when I saw him, he'd already made that big journey. Now, the important part of this from a biological perspective is a couple fold. One, left to their own devices, the tigers that were reintroduced to that park populated it really quickly. Tigers are actually really good at growing their population size very quickly. And they can also move from one park to another, which means that if another park is having fewer tigers, then they can be connected to each other. And a few tigers moving this way or that way in each generation actually makes all of the parks healthier. Parks can get sort of isolated in space, especially when there's like agricultural lands all around them. And that's not necessarily good for the animals. Having a few animals that move from one place to another can do a lot to make the parks healthier. And so this one individual tiger was really interesting because he basically exemplified how we hope parks will work, which is that we can protect animals within them, but that they can also then move between those different parks.
Right. I learned that just reading the early part here, that the country, India, controls, I believe, tigers. They have law there to protect tigers. Is that right?
Yeah. And most countries that have tigers still do have laws to protect them. It doesn't necessarily mean that the laws are followed. Tigers used to be across a whole giant swath of different parts of Asia. Today, I think the estimate is that their current populations are in about 7% of where they used to live. So they've lost sort of 93% of the habitat they used to live in. And a lot of that's been from development and growth of human populations. And so what's left are these little pockets where tigers can still be found in places like Russia and China and Thailand, Malaysia. And a lot of those populations are really small. India has the world's most tigers right now. The last set of estimates that I saw were that India has about 3/4 of the world's tigers. And India's populations of tigers have actually been growing pretty rapidly. Part of the reason is that, issues like I was talking about earlier with poaching, India has done a pretty good job of trying to curtail some of that poaching through things like enforcement. And as a result, if you can create a space for tigers to live, their populations tend to go up pretty quickly if they're not being, shot or killed by people in other ways.
Right. My virtual assistants we get from Mac, who started us out here on this conversation. He's from India, so I'll have to ask him about that. And let's go to number 2. And it reminds me of me. It says an irresistible urge.
So that chapter is about salmon. And the irresistible urge part is about the point in a salmon's life when it decides to go back to the stream that it came from to spawn. So salmon are funny creatures because they start their life in streams or lakes. They are buried as eggs by their parents in the gravel. And then sometime later they hatch and they eventually move their way downstream into the ocean. But then at some point in their life, they decide, it's time to go back. And they start on this voyage where they're mostly trying to get back to exactly the same place where they started as an egg. They've only ever been there once, and they have to figure out how to navigate that pathway to get there. And salmon are especially interesting because in doing so, they create a really interesting set of fisheries where most fisheries for salmon are trying to intercept them when they're coming back. And so it creates this challenge in fisheries management of how do you catch some of the fish, but let enough of the fish back to go back to the gravel to spawn the next generation. And the story there is about a place called Bristol Bay in Alaska, which has arguably the most sustainable modern salmon fishery that we know of, where fishers in that system have been catching, on the order of half of the fish that return every single year since the late 1800s. And today, in fact, last summer, had one of the highest returns of salmon ever to that population. And so it's really interesting that if you imagine half of their population has been caught every year for more than a century, and yet they're doing as well or better than they ever have. And what's going on there is a trick of biology, that usually what happens to species is that when they get really, really crowded, they tend not to have as many offspring, or not as many of their offspring survive. But if you thin them out a little bit, their reproductive rates will often go up. And that's how a lot of fisheries work. And so in that fishery, what the fishery does is it actually removes some of the individuals, makes the system less crowded, which means those that are lucky enough to get to spawn, they're much more likely to have more offspring that survive and make it back. In fact, usually for a fish that spawns in a stream, or a pair of fish that's to try and spawn in there later in life. So the population size would be growing exponentially, except the fishery keeps catching the extra ones and keeping them from going upstream.
All this is so interesting, the way you lay it out and the depth that you get a guy like me interested in it. I'll have to put this more, I guess, some more. And we're running out of time.
Oh dear, already?
Yeah. I want to ask you if you would give my audience, my listeners, information on where your books are. And
sure.
Go ahead, please.
So just to repeat, the book is called The Rescue Effect, and it is should be on sale. Certainly you can get it online without any problem whatsoever at big sellers like Amazon, et cetera. But you can also look at your local bookstore. Some of them, many of them are carrying it. And if they're not, you can ask the manager of the bookstore to get some in stock.
Yes. Now, before I give you my famous adios, I have one more time. Chapter 4, A Babe in the Woods. What's that?
The babe in the woods is the American chestnut tree, which is a species of tree that was really important in the eastern US more than 100 years ago, but declined dramatically due to an accidentally introduced disease which attacked all the trees. As far as we know, every sort of above ground thing that you would call a tree died in that process. But some of the roots survived, and they keep growing from those roots. That chapter is about the century-long effort to try and bring that species back through a combination of selective breeding, of hybridizing trees with other species of chestnuts from different parts of the world, to most recently creating a genetically modified American chestnut tree that is better than anything we've seen before in its ability to fight this new disease. And so it may be that the American chestnut is no longer going to be a babe in the woods. It may be able to survive going forward because of all these efforts to try and bring it back.
That's good news. Very good news. Well, let me thank you for being on my show. It's a different show, and I like to see that people like it. And I'm glad that you came aboard to let all my listeners know that they didn't know as much as they thought.
Well, listen, what I would say to your listeners is give the book a try. Hopefully I've made these stories super engaging so that I can suck you in on the story, and maybe you'll learn a little biology along the way.
Of course. And I want to thank my listeners for tuning in to Searching for Integrity. So long. And happy trails to all.